The spring wind carried the scent of melting snow across the Colorado foothills, but no warmth could soften the silence waiting at the Dawson Ranch. A wedding had just taken place without music, without dancing, and without celebration. One lonely rider approached the weathered homestead beside the woman he had promised to stand beside for the rest of his life, while two children watched from a distance as though a stranger had come to replace the father they still mourned. Sometimes the hardest trail a cowboy ever rides begins not on a mountain pass, but on the front porch of the home he hopes one day will accept him. Before we continue this journey together, we'd love to invite you into our growing frontier family. If stories of courage, redemption, faith, and the American West speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe. Every week we share original Western tales crafted to bring hope, adventure, and unforgettable characters to life. Now, let us return to Silver Creek, Colorado, in the spring of 1902. We arrive beside Jacob Carter, as his bay gelding slowed before the weathered split-rail fence surrounding the Dawson Ranch. The mountains still wore patches of snow, while green shoots pushed stubbornly through the thawing earth. Smoke curled gently from the stone chimney, and the faded red barn stood proudly against years of wind and winter, a reminder that this ranch had survived many hardships before today. Jacob removed his black felt hat and glanced toward Emily Dawson. Number: Emily Carter now. The title felt unfamiliar even to her. She sat quietly in the wagon, her chestnut braid resting across one shoulder, her hazel eyes filled with both hope and worry. She had buried her husband nearly 3 years earlier, fought through drought and harsh winters, and finally accepted that neither she nor her children could carry the ranch alone forever. Jacob had never tried to replace the man she had lost. He had only offered to help carry what remained. As they reached the porch, the front door opened. Old Ben Dawson stepped outside first, leaning heavily upon his walking cane. His silver beard moved with the breeze as his wise eyes studied Jacob. Without a word, the elderly man extended his weathered hand. Jacob accepted it firmly. "Welcome home, son." Those 3 simple words carried more kindness than Jacob expected. But another pair of eyes waited behind the porch railing. Samuel Dawson. 14 years old, already nearly as tall as his mother. His brown hair fell across his forehead as he crossed his arms tightly. Jacob stepped toward him slowly. "Samuel." The boy nodded politely. Jacob offered his hand. "I've looked forward to meeting you." Samuel stared at the hand for several long seconds. The silence settled over the porch. Finally, the boy lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." He took one careful step backward. "I can't." He turned without another word and disappeared toward the barn. Jacob slowly lowered his hand, not in anger, not in disappointment, simply with understanding. Emily's shoulders sank. "I'm so sorry." Jacob offered a small smile. "He doesn't owe me anything." Then another small movement caught his attention. Behind one of the porch posts peeked a tiny face framed by golden curls. Bright blue eyes watched him carefully. Little Lily Dawson, 9 years old. The moment Jacob smiled toward her, she vanished behind the post again, as though hiding from a bear. Only the edge of her faded blue ribbon remained visible. Jacob chuckled softly. "I think I frightened her." Emily managed a faint smile. "She isn't frightened." "What is it then? What is it then?" Emily looked toward the empty yard. "She's afraid loving someone new means forgetting her father." Jacob nodded quietly. No answer could heal wounds like that. Inside the ranch house, little had changed over the years. The same sturdy oak table, the same cast-iron stove, the same family photographs resting upon the mantel. One portrait stood above the fireplace. Thomas Dawson, strong, smiling, standing proudly beside Emily and the children years earlier. Jacob paused before it. He removed his hat once more. After a long moment, he whispered softly, "I hope I can honor what you built." No one answered. But somehow the room felt just a little less heavy. That evening passed quietly. Old Ben spoke about the spring calves. Emily prepared supper. Samuel remained outside until darkness covered the valley. Lily barely whispered a single word during the meal. No one called Jacob father. No one called him anything at all. After supper, Jacob stepped onto the porch, where Emily stood watching the stars appear above the mountains. The wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth across the valley. Emily folded her arms tightly. I don't know how long this will take. Jacob looked toward the barn where Samuel had disappeared earlier. It may take years. I'm afraid they'll never accept you. Jacob smiled gently beneath the moonlight. Then he spoke the words that neither Emily nor the children would ever forget. I'll never ask them to call me father. He looked back toward the quiet house. I'll earn it. Emily's eyes filled with grateful tears. She reached for his hand. Together they stood silently beneath the Colorado stars. Weeks passed. Jacob repaired fences before sunrise. He mended broken gates. He quietly left fresh apples where Lily liked to sit beneath the old cottonwood tree. He never pushed Samuel into conversation. He simply worked beside him whenever the opportunity came. Little by little, the ranch breathed easier. But spring on the frontier could turn dangerous without warning. One violent afternoon, dark clouds rolled across the valley as dozens of frightened cattle thundered through the lower pasture after lightning struck nearby. Samuel had ridden ahead alone to close the south gate. He never saw the stampede racing directly toward him. Jacob did. Without a second's hesitation, he drove his spurs into his horse and charged straight toward the terrified herd. Snowmelt had swollen the creek beyond its banks, turning the narrow crossing into a ribbon of churning brown water. Hundreds of longhorns surged toward it in blind panic, their hooves pounding the soaked earth, while terrified cowhands shouted in every direction. Dust mixed with spray, until the valley disappeared behind a gray cloud of chaos. Then we saw him. Samuel Dawson. The 14-year-old had ridden ahead to close a broken gate before anyone realized how quickly the herd was moving. His horse stumbled against the muddy bank, throwing the boy hard onto the ground. Before he could stand, the front of the stampede was almost upon him. If stories about courage, family, and the American frontier warm your heart, we'd be honored if you subscribed and joined us for more journeys like this one. Jacob Carter never hesitated. His bay horse exploded forward. Samuel! Emily screamed from the ridge above, her voice nearly swallowed by the roar of the cattle. Jacob leaned low over his saddle, weaving through the charging herd with the confidence of a man who had spent his life reading frightened animals. One enormous steer lunged across his path. Jacob pulled hard on the reins, slipping past its horns by inches before launching from his saddle. He hit Samuel with enough force to send them both tumbling behind a massive cottonwood log beside the creek. A heartbeat later, dozens of pounding hooves thundered past where the boy had been lying. The earth trembled. Dust rolled over them. For several endless seconds, neither of them moved. Finally, Jacob pushed himself upright, coughing through the dirt. You hurt? Samuel stared at him, too stunned to answer. Jacob checked the boy's arms and shoulders before helping him carefully to his feet. You'll have some bruises, he said with a small smile. But you'll live. Only then did Samuel find his voice. Thank you. Those were the first words of gratitude he had ever spoken to the man who had married his mother. Jacob simply nodded. Let's get home. Emily reached them before they crossed the pasture. She wrapped Samuel so tightly in her arms that neither of them spoke for several moments. Old Ben Dawson arrived beside them, leaning heavily on his cane. His experienced eyes settled on Jacob. You saved him. Jacob shrugged quietly. I did what anyone would have done. Old Ben smiled beneath his thick gray beard. No. He looked directly into Jacob's eyes. Not everyone would. The life on the Dawson Ranch slowly returned to its rhythm. The spring grass pushed through the melting snow. Calves filled the pastures. Fence posts weakened by winter storms had to be replaced. Jacob threw himself into the work before sunrise, every morning without asking anyone for recognition. Samuel noticed. Jacob repaired broken corrals. He sharpened tools. He worked beside hired hands instead of ordering them around. Whenever Samuel struggled with a difficult task, Jacob offered help only if the boy asked. Sometimes Samuel accepted. Sometimes he refused. Jacob never complained either way. Picture this. Lily remained different. The shy little girl still disappeared whenever strangers visited the ranch. Yet she began watching Jacob from the porch while he worked. One afternoon, she wandered cautiously toward the corral, carrying a small wooden bucket. Jacob was repairing a section of split-rail fence. She stopped several feet away. "You forgot your nails." Jacob looked up. "So I did." She quietly handed him the bucket. He smiled. "Thank you." Lily nodded and hurried back toward the house. She hadn't said another word. But the next afternoon she returned, and the afternoon after that. Soon she sat nearby while Jacob worked, quietly watching him shape rails, mend gates, and shoe horses. Sometimes he explained what he was doing. Sometimes they simply enjoyed the peaceful silence together. Emily noticed everything. Late one evening, after the children had gone upstairs, she found Jacob oiling an old saddle inside the barn. "You've done more for them than I ever expected." Jacob kept rubbing the worn leather. "They've done just as much for me." Emily smiled sadly. "They still won't call you family." Jacob looked toward the loft where Samuel and Lily slept. "They're healing." He set the saddle aside. He lost his father. Lily barely remembers smiling. "They don't owe me anything." Emily's eyes filled with quiet tears. "I wish this were easier." Jacob reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "It doesn't have to be easy. It only has to be honest." Weeks passed. Weeks passed. The Dawson Ranch slowly flourished again. Even Sheriff Owen Briggs commented that the ranch looked stronger than it had in years. Not everyone celebrated. Across the valley, Victor Kane watched from the porch of his sprawling ranch house. His polished boots rested against the railing while he studied the Dawson property through a brass field glass. "They're surviving." One of his hired foremen nodded nervously. "Better than expected." Victor lowered the glass. "I was told the widow would sell by spring. Instead," he frowned. "That cowboy is holding everything together." His eyes narrowed toward Jacob repairing another pasture fence beside Samuel. "Families like that don't stay united forever." A slow smile spread across Victor Kane's face. "We simply need to help them fall apart." Tom. 2 mornings later, Samuel rode into town alone to collect fence wire from the blacksmith. As he crossed behind the general store, he heard familiar voices drifting from the alley beside the freight warehouse. Victor Kane. Samuel instinctively stopped. Hidden behind stacked feed barrels, he listened. Victor laughed quietly. "It won't be long now." One of his men asked, "What if the cowboy keeps fixing the ranch?" Victor folded his gloves with complete confidence. "The ranch isn't my concern. The widow is. When she's desperate enough, she'll sell me every acre." Samuel's heart began pounding. Then Victor spoke the words that made his blood run cold. "I've already made certain she won't have any other choice." Victor Kane's footsteps faded into the busy sounds of Silver Creek, but Samuel Dawson remained frozen behind the stacked feed barrels. The morning breeze carried the smell of fresh-cut lumber and horse leather through the alley, yet all he could hear were the final words echoing inside his mind. "I've already made certain she won't have any other choice." The 14-year-old felt his stomach tighten. For weeks, he had believed Victor Kane was simply another wealthy rancher trying to buy neighboring land. Now he understood something far darker was unfolding. Without stopping at the blacksmith, Samuel mounted his horse and urged it toward home. The ride back to the Dawson Ranch felt longer than ever before. Every hill seemed steeper, every mile heavier. One question refused to leave him. Who could he trust? The answer surprised him. Jacob. We found Jacob Carter repairing a section of broken fence along the north pasture when Samuel galloped into the yard. The boy jumped from his saddle before the horse had fully stopped. "Mr. Carter." Jacob looked up immediately. Something in Samuel's voice erased the smile from his face. "What happened?" Samuel glanced toward the ranch house. "Not here." Jacob quietly laid down his hammer. Without another question, he followed Samuel toward the old equipment shed behind the barn. Once they were alone, Samuel finally spoke. "I heard Victor Kane." Jacob listened without interruption as the boy repeated every word he had overheard behind the general store. Not once did Jacob dismiss him. Not once did he suggest the boy had misunderstood. When Samuel finished, silence settled over the shed. Jacob folded his arms. "Thank you for telling me." Samuel lowered his eyes. "I didn't know who else to trust." Those words meant more than Jacob allowed himself to show. He simply rested one steady hand on Samuel's shoulder. "You did the right thing." 2. That evening, Jacob rode into town. Sheriff Owen Briggs was finishing paperwork inside the small jail office when the familiar cowboy stepped through the door. The sheriff removed his spectacles. "You look troubled." Jacob quietly explained everything Samuel had heard. Owen Briggs leaned back in his chair. "I've never trusted Victor Kane. But suspicion isn't enough. We'll need proof." Jacob nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." "Sure." The following morning began before sunrise. Jacob, Sheriff Briggs, and Old Ben Dawson traveled together to the historic Silver Creek County Records Office. The elderly county clerk greeted them warmly before leading them toward towering wooden shelves filled with weathered leather ledgers. Dust floated through the morning sunlight as they searched decades of land surveys. Hours passed. Nothing. Jacob carefully replaced another heavy ledger. There has to be something. Old Ben rested both hands on his cane. "The Dawson Ranch boundaries have existed since before my son was born. They couldn't simply disappear." The clerk frowned thoughtfully. "Unless..." He slowly walked toward the oldest shelves in the building. There were duplicate survey copies. Sheriff Briggs looked up. "Where?" The clerk pointed toward a forgotten storage room. "No one's opened those cabinets in years." Inside the narrow archive room, thick dust covered nearly everything. Jacob carefully pulled open one warped wooden drawer after another. Survey maps, mining claims, old homestead records. Then Sheriff Briggs stopped. "I found something." Everyone gathered around. The faded leather cover read, "Silver Creek County Surveys, 1878 to 1884. Jacob carefully opened the fragile volume. Page after page revealed hand-drawn property lines. Then one map stopped everyone. Old Ben's eyes widened. That's it. Across the yellowed parchment lay the original Dawson Ranch survey. Every boundary remained exactly as Old Ben remembered. But another mark caught Sheriff Briggs' attention. Someone had altered later copies. Fresher ink-covered portions of the original boundary lines. Victor Kane's ranch appeared significantly larger. Jacob quietly studied both versions. The official records were changed. Sheriff Briggs nodded slowly. And someone expected nobody would ever compare them. The county clerk adjusted his glasses. "I've never seen forgery this carefully done." Old Ben smiled for the first time in days. The ranch was never for sale. It was stolen. By evening, the sheriff had already begun preparing formal documents. Victor Kane would soon have questions to answer. But Jacob wasn't celebrating. He knew men like Victor rarely surrendered quietly. Sink. The next afternoon, Jacob rode alone toward the river crossing to inspect damaged fencing washed away by spring runoff. The rushing water echoed through the valley, while cottonwood leaves shimmered in the breeze. He dismounted beside the narrow bridge. Then came another sound, the unmistakable click of a rifle hammer being drawn back. Jacob slowly turned. Victor Kane stood 20 yards away on the opposite riverbank. His polished black boots rested firmly against the rocks. A Winchester rifle remained aimed directly at Jacob's chest. Victor's confident smile never reached his eyes. "I warned you." His finger tightened against the trigger. "To stay out of my business." Victor Kane's confident smile barely moved as the barrel of his Winchester remained fixed on Jacob Carter's chest. The river rushed loudly beneath the weathered wooden bridge, carrying melting snow toward the valley below. Cottonwood branches swayed overhead, but the peaceful sounds of spring could not soften the danger, standing only a few yards away. Jacob never reached for the revolver resting on his gun belt. Instead, he stood calmly beside his bay horse. "We don't have to do this, Victor." Victor laughed once. "Oh, We absolutely do. You've ruined months of careful planning. He took one slow step closer. If you'd simply minded your own ranch, none of this would have happened. Jacob's blue eyes never left the rifle. The truth always finds its way home. Victor's expression hardened. Not this time. Before another word could be spoken, a familiar voice echoed across the river. "Drop the rifle." Sheriff Owen Briggs emerged from the trees, with 2 deputies beside him. Behind them came old Ben Dawson, Samuel, Emily, even little Lily. Victor turned too slowly. Sheriff Briggs already had his revolver drawn. "Victor Kane," the sheriff's voice carried across the valley. "You're under arrest for land fraud, forgery, intimidation." He glanced toward Jacob. "And attempted murder." Victor looked desperately toward the mountains. There would be no escape. The rifle slowly slipped from his hands before landing heavily against the rocks. The deputies crossed the bridge and secured him without another struggle. As they led Victor away, he looked back toward Jacob. "You think you've won," Jacob answered quietly. "No. The truth did." The following week, the Silver Creek courthouse overflowed with ranchers, farmers, merchants, and families. Judge Abigail Harper carefully examined the original Dawson survey, alongside the forged county copies recovered by Sheriff Briggs. The elderly county clerk testified first. Then Sheriff Briggs presented every document uncovered inside the records office. Finally, old Ben Dawson slowly stood before the courtroom. Leaning on his cane, he pointed toward the original survey. "My son built that ranch honestly. My grandchildren nearly lost everything because one man believed greed mattered more than truth." The courtroom remained silent. Judge Harper lowered her spectacles. "The evidence is overwhelming." She turned toward Victor Kane. "This court rules that all fraudulent claims against the Dawson Ranch are hereby dismissed. The original Dawson boundaries are fully restored." A smile spread across old Ben's weathered face. Emily quietly covered her mouth as grateful tears filled her hazel eyes. Samuel closed his eyes with relief. Little Lily squeezed Jacob's hand without even realizing she had done it. Outside the courthouse, the entire town erupted into applause. Moon. Spring settled fully across the valley. Neighboring ranchers arrived with wagons full of lumber. Blacksmiths repaired broken gates. Cowhands rebuilt damaged corrals. Families stacked fresh hay beside the barns. The Dawson Ranch slowly became stronger than it had ever been before. Jacob worked harder than anyone. Not because he wanted praise, because that was simply who he was. He never reminded Samuel about the stampede. He never mentioned the courtroom. He never expected gratitude. Each morning he simply saddled his horse before sunrise and began another day's work. Weeks later, the family gathered around the familiar oak table inside the ranch house. Warm lantern light danced across the wooden walls. Fresh bread rested beside a pot of beef stew. Outside, spring rain tapped softly against the windows. Old Ben offered a quiet prayer before everyone began eating. The conversation came easily now. Lily proudly described the calf she had helped bottle feed. Emily laughed more than she had in years. Even Samuel joined the conversation. Jacob listened quietly, smiling as he passed bowls around the table. For him, that was enough. He had never expected anything more. Then Samuel looked up. For a brief moment, the room became completely still. The 14-year-old cleared his throat. "Dad." Jacob's hand stopped halfway toward the bread basket. Samuel smiled shyly. "Could you pass the bread?" The loaf nearly slipped from Jacob's hands. He looked at the boy, unable to speak. Emily's eyes instantly filled with tears. She covered her face as quiet sobs escaped through grateful laughter. Old Ben removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes with a weathered handkerchief. Jacob slowly passed the bread across the table. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Of course," Lily giggled. Then she leaned toward Jacob with the biggest smile he had ever seen. "I always wanted to call you Dad." Jacob closed his eyes for just a second. All the lonely miles he had ridden, every fence he had repaired, every silent act of kindness, every moment of patience. None of it had been wasted. Love had arrived exactly as he promised Emily it would. Not demanded. Earned. Thick. That evening, after supper, Jacob stepped onto the porch as the sun disappeared behind the Colorado mountains. The pastures glowed beneath the last golden light. Inside the house, he could hear Lily laughing. Samuel was helping old Ben stack firewood. Emily's gentle voice drifted through the open window. For the first time since arriving at the Dawson Ranch, Jacob realized something. He had not replaced anyone. Thomas Dawson would always be remembered. Instead, he had simply become another man worthy of being loved by the family Thomas cherished. Sometimes the strongest fathers are not the ones who give us life. They are the ones who quietly spend every day proving they deserve a place in our hearts. Thank you for riding this trail with us. If this story warmed your heart, we'd love to have you join us for more original frontier tales of courage, family, faith, and hope. Until next time, may your trails be safe, your campfires warm, and your heart always find its way home.